Hello everyone, welcome back to the Other Animals podcast. I'm very excited for this second episode. It's going to be a very triggering one, just be prepared. So I do a lot of outreach, vegan outreach, and I've started comparing the oppression some humans face to the oppression that animals face. And I haven't done the whole holocaust comparison in outreach yet, because let's face it, it's the most triggering one, I think, probably. When you mention the comparison between the animal holocaust to the human holocaust, especially the Jewish holocaust, people get very, very triggered. So first I want to talk about the definition of holocaust. And as a disclaimer, I just want to obviously say that I'm not trying to disrespect anyone, of course. I'm just trying to explore this subject because it is important to talk about it for the sake of the animals and for people to understand where vegans are coming from when they make this comparison. So, Holocaust, it's the definition from Oxford Languages. The first definition is the destruction or slaughter on a mass scale, especially caused by fire or nuclear war. Another aspect of this definition refers to the mass murder of Jewish people under the German Nazi regime. And the second definition, that is more historical, is the sacrifice in which the offering was burned completely on an altar. I want to read a quote from a book called The Longest Struggle by Noam Phelps. It's basically a book about the history of the animal movement. In this book, at some point, he talks about animal sacrifice. This part of the chapter is called Slaughterhouses of Worship. Quote, "We think of houses of worship as serene, comforting places where we hear inspirational messages, sing hymns, and commune peacefully with God. But the most important and most frequent ritual in classical paganism, which was back then the equivalent of the Catholic Mass or Protestant worship service, was animal sacrifice. Ancient temples were abattoirs, adjacent to pens and cages filled with angry, terrified, squalling, screaming, bellowing, bleating, pissing, shitting cattle, sheep, goats, and birds, waiting to be taken onto the killing floor that was the heart of the temple. The altar was a chopping block for the commission of ritual murder. The priest's primary role was to serve as a butcher who killed while chanting the sacred formulas that would assure the deity's acceptance of the offering. At the end of a service in which they sent the prayers of their parishioners heavenward on the smoke from the seared flesh of a murdered animal, their hands and vestments were covered with blood, and they stank with the mortal terror and violent death of their victims. Classical paganism was a cult of mass killing. Most ancient temples were also businesses. Worshippers would pay a fee for sacrifices, in addition to which they would either donate the animal to be killed, or they would kick in some extra money, and the priests would purchase the victim. In a typical sacrifice, once the animal had been killed, the butcher priest would lay him out on the altar and dress the meat. Most often, a small portion would be offered to the deity. Some would be set aside for the priests and their families, and the rest would be sold for a profit. Temples were the meat markets of the Greco-Roman world. In many Roman cities, the only place you could find meat that had not been offered to a pagan deity was a kosher butcher shop run by Jews." End quote. So basically the term Holocaust used to refer to animal sacrifice before it was used for what happened to Jews and other groups of people during the Second World War. Human sacrifice was also employed in religious rituals in the past, and of course we look back on these with horror. This is the stuff of horror movies, basically. The difference between human sacrifice and animal sacrifice doesn't have much to do with the sentience. Thankfully, human sacrifice is no longer a thing, at least it's not legal, but animal sacrifice is still going on in the world, religious sacrifice. And I'm only talking about religious sacrifice right now, not talking about the other types of murders and horrific treatment that animals are going through right now. I want to talk a little bit about some Holocaust survivors that have become vegan activists and have talked about this comparison. And some of them were the first ones to actually draw a comparison between the animal Holocaust and the human Holocaust. So there's this Holocaust survivor, Alex Hershaft. One of his quotes reads, "We're focusing on the victims rather than the cancer of oppression itself." Another one, "I noted with horror the striking similarities between what the Nazis did to my family and my people and what we do to animals we raise for food. The branding or tattooing of serial numbers to identify victims, the use of cattle cars to transport victims to their death, the crowded housing of victims in wood crates, the arbitrary designation of who lives and who dies. The Christian lives, the Jew dies, the dog lives, the pig dies. End quote. There's 2 more quotes from this man that I want to share with you. Quote, "Why animals? Because that's the root, the most universally accepted form of oppression. And it's not about the animals. It's about us. It's about who we are, how we treat the least defensible, the most oppressed, the weakest in our society. What does it say about us?" End quote. Never again is not about what others shouldn't do to us. It's about what we shouldn't do to others. Never again means that we must never again perpetrate mass atrocities against other living beings. That we must never again raise animals for food or any other form of exploitation. So I find these quotes obviously very powerful. I remember reading about how he became a vegan. He went to a slaughterhouse for some type of inspection, or he was visiting it to document something for his work. And he was struck while in the slaughterhouse by basically how similar this was to what happened to the Jews and other oppressed groups during the Second World War. And I can't even imagine the realization for someone like him especially, who has been through these horrific things, not only to realize that this was still happening for some creatures, but that he was actually participating in it. Another Holocaust survivor who is very well known is Isaac Bashevis Singer. One of his quotes reads, "What do they know, all these scholars, all these philosophers, all the leaders of the world, about such as you? They have convinced themselves that man, the worst transgressor of all the species, is the crown of creation. All other creatures were created merely to provide him with food, pelts, to be tormented, exterminated. In relation to them, all people are Nazis. For the animals, it is an eternal Treblinka." The next quote is from a book of his. Quote, "As often as Hermann had witnessed the slaughter of animals and fish, he always had the same thought. In their behavior toward creatures, all men were Nazis." So the next people are not Holocaust survivors, they're just people who have spoken about this. There's this very powerful quote from Theodor Adorno. "Auschwitz begins wherever someone looks at a slaughterhouse and thinks they're only animals." End quote. In 2014, a philosopher and animal rights activist named Stephen Best was basically making the point that using phrases like animal holocaust is a serious way to help people understand, quote, "the incomprehensible scale and scope of the violence humans inflict on animals. Around 2.7 trillion per year to 3 trillion. It's around 80 billion land animals that are exploited and killed every year. And I think it's only for food, this number. And around 2.7 trillion fish." Stephen Best also says that the conditions of the CAFOs resemble the mechanized production lines of concentration camps, where animals are forced to produce maximal quantities of meat, milk, and eggs, an intense coercion that takes place through physical confinement, but also now through chemical and genetic manipulation. As typical in Nazi compounds, this forced and intensive labor terminates in death. Now, I want to have a side note about Hitler being a vegetarian. I used to receive that one much more than I do now, but I think this is something I need to address in this episode. Hitler was not a vegetarian. It's a myth that was basically a PR campaign orchestrated by his Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels. You can read more about that in Robert Payne's book on Hitler. It was really about asceticism and about how he saw in service of his people, meaning he wouldn't be distracted by the pursuit of pleasures. He actually suffered of some medical conditions too that made him avoid animal flesh sometimes. He was actually vehemently against vegetarianism. He banned all the German vegetarian societies in 1933 and arrested their leaders. He also would beat his dog in public with a whip. He based his treatment of the Jews on the assembly line slaughterhouses of the US. He basically replaced animals with humans. He was all about might makes right. Even if that were to be true that he was a vegetarian anyways, what about all the horrible people in history who weren't vegetarian? Also, vegetarians still exploit and use animals, which is what veganism rejects. It really boils my blood when someone says Hitler was vegetarian because, one, it's not true, and second, he based his treatment of the Jews on how we treat animals. The Nazis modeled extermination camps after slaughterhouses. Gas chambers are still employed for animals. There's been campaigns showing that pigs especially are killed with gas in slaughterhouses. The gas basically burns them from the inside out. It's interesting how people shiver at the mention of gas chambers in the Second World War, but when you confront them often with the fact that we're still using gas chambers, people will be shocked, but then they'll try to find an excuse to continue doing that to the animals. You know, when we ask ourselves, if I had been alive back then, what would I have done? As a French person, I remember thinking that because I think that in France we're taught about the Second World War quite a bit, considering our government was totally cooperating with Hitler at some point. And of course, when people ask themselves that question, they're always like, of course I would have been a resistant. I would have done something. Well, this is the test, right? There is a holocaust going on right now. Trillions of animals are killed and exploited each year. And I think that's only for food alone. So even more animals are exploited and killed for leather or whatever it is, laboratory experiments. Once you know about that, what are you going to do about it? Is not participating in it enough? Is turning a blind eye enough? Or should we all be basically activists? I also want to talk about how people often say this is dehumanizing. When someone is not treated well and someone is oppressed, we say, oh, they're dehumanized. And that says a lot. I've heard people describe the Holocaust as the dehumanization of Jews and the other marginalized groups that were oppressed. And that says a lot about our relationship to other animals, doesn't it? When we treat a human like we do an animal, we see very clearly how messed up that treatment is. It's quite sad that it takes us being the victim for us to actually understand that this is wrong. Humans are just another species of animal. Animals are sentient like us, they feel pain. There was a billboard campaign in January 2023 by Gen V that said, every 30 minutes, we take as many lives as the Second World War took in 6 years. Which part of this makes you angry? And I think that was a brilliant campaign. So we're coming to the point where we have to ask ourselves now, why do people get triggered? I think the reason it is offensive is because we see non-humans as so inferior to humans that the mere comparison is an insult. It's like in the past people would use gay as an insult. The thing is, I don't see it as an insult because I don't see animals as inferior to humans. We both are part of the animalia kingdom and are sentient beings. I compare all humans to other animals, not just certain groups of people. It's not about lowering the status of some humans to the status of animals so that we can oppress these humans. It's about elevating the status of animals to the status of humans so that we can protect these animals from exploitation and use and oppression. I think using the correct words for what we're describing as activists is very important. I think the context in which we use them is important as well. I think it's important to use these words, especially in the context of outreach, with care and rapport, building rapport before we use them. And I think it's always better to ask questions to get people to make the comparison themselves. Which, by the way, if you want to see how that's done, Debug Your Brain on YouTube has done this. I was completely shocked to see how incredibly powerful and just the fact that it was working. So go check that out. So in the end, it's not disrespectful to the human victims to make this comparison. It's disrespectful to the animals to say that you can't. What happened to these people is atrocious, and what is happening to these animals is atrocious. And none of it should have ever happened. Thankfully, it stopped for the humans, in this case, the people that were holocausted during the Second World War. But it's still happening for the animals. The people who understand the kind of victimization animals are going through right now understand this. It's always about looking at it from the victim's perspective. I want to leave you with a quote from Helmut Kaplan. Our children will ask us one day, where were you during the Holocaust of the animals? What did you do against these horrifying crimes? We won't be able to offer the same excuse for the second time, that we didn't know. So thanks so much for listening. Go vegan if you aren't already. Advocate for the animals. It's very important for us to actually speak up for them. We are the only defenders they have, so please speak up, use correct terms, and have a good one. See ya!